Good morning. Welcome to Pleasant View First Baptist Church LifeView. I'm Toney Collier. I'll be leading the lesson this morning. And this week we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 7. There are some verses in here that are very familiar to us. A lot of times we don't read them at this time of the year, as you'll come to see as we get further along through this lesson. But I want to talk to us just a little bit about some context for this lesson this morning. Let's do a little background information. And then we'll get into the meat of the lesson this week. Isaiah chapter 7 took place at a time when the northern kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Aram, which is modern day Syria, had joined forces to resist the growing power of the Assyrian Empire to their northeast. King Ahaz of Judah did not want to join their coalition, likely due to the fear of reprisals from the Assyrians. And this resistance concerned the northern kingdoms. They worried that unless they could force the southern kingdom of Judah to join their alliance, Judah could attack their southern borders while they were fighting the Assyrians. Then they would have a war with two enemies on two different fronts. That's a bad situation to be in. To avoid this scenario, Aram and Israel decided to force the issue to invade Judah and take control of the country and its military resources. This imminent invasion terrified King Ahaz and the people. It was in this context that God sent Isaiah to Ahaz with a message of encouragement. Unfortunately, Ahaz didn't accept Isaiah's message. As a result, God declared in graphic terms that Judah would be punished for its lack of faith. In the coming judgment via the Assyrian invasion, both Israel and Aram would suffer greatly, but so would Judah. Even the child born to Isaiah in chapter 8 was named with this judgment in mind. That's a pretty interesting fact. God told Isaiah to name his newborn son Meir Shalal Hashbaz, which means speeding to the plunder, hurrying to the spoil. God's judgment was coming in the form of the invading Assyrian army. The only hope for God's people was found in God himself, whether the Assyrians recognized it or not. Thankfully, though, this was not the end of the story. In chapter 9, God promised an amazing two-part hope for the future. First, the Assyrians would get their due punishment in time. God's justice would catch up to them. Secondly, God would send a child. This would be no ordinary child. He is called the Eternal Father, the Prince of Peace. In a manner, Isaiah's audience probably would have struggled to understand God promised deliverance through a child who was both human and God. We have the hindsight of seeing Jesus as the fulfillment of this prophecy, but how marvelous and how confusing it must have been to the faithful in Isaiah's audience. A few hundred years before the birth of Christ, this was an astounding idea. It still is an astounding idea that someone could be both God and man. From hope, Isaiah turns back to judgment, though. The corruption and faithlessness of God's people had to be dealt with, and the second half of chapter 9 details the coming consequences. When faced with God's discipline, many would turn away rather than turning to him in repentance and humility. Ultimately, the northern kingdom was almost completely wiped out. The failure of the Assyrians to recognize God would result in them being destroyed completely. Yet even in judgment, there was a note of hope. A remnant, a small portion of God's people, would survive, and God promised that they would return to their land one day. That's one thing God has promised. There's always a remnant, no matter how bad times get. Like a breath of fresh air, chapters 11 and 12 bring the promise of restoration through the Messianic king, a descendant of David. This promised figure would be a true king. His focus would be on God and on pleasing God. Everything he did would be a result of this focus. The effect of this rule would be the establishment of an idyllic setting that reflects the Garden of Eden prior to the fall. The remnant would return to this restored garden and rejoice. That's one of the things that the theme of Brad's in-game series that he preached on recently is the restoration of this of the idyllic setting of the garden before the fall, and we're heading back that way in God's timing. This progression is a notable pattern found throughout the prophets. Sin results in judgment, but judgment is followed by restoration and peace. Indeed, judgment is the punishment required for peace to be established. So let's get into the meat of our lesson this morning. We're going to start in Isaiah chapter 7, and verses 7 through 9. And this is what Isaiah is telling King Ahaz, what God has to say to him. Verses 7 through 9 say this. This is what the Lord God says. It will not happen. It will not occur. The chief city of Aram is Damascus. The chief of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The chief city of Ephraim is Samaria, and the chief of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you do not stand firm in your faith, then you will not stand at all. So let's take this apart and explore it a little bit at a time. It will not happen. It will not occur, God says. This statement from God goes back to the previous verses. The people of Judah and King Ahaz were terrified of the impending invasion from the north. Through Isaiah, God stated point blank that Ahaz had nothing to worry about. What he feared would not happen. God expressed this fact to emphasize the certainty that there was nothing to worry about. The difficulty for Ahaz and Judah was believing it. The reality they faced was a gathering army on their doorstep. Trusting God's promise before it came to pass is always a challenge, even for the most faithful. That's something that sometimes we struggle with too, that we can find ourselves in the midst of difficulties that seem overwhelming, and though God's promised to be with us, we know what we see, but sometimes we struggle with what we believe. God goes on to talk about what's going to happen to Ahaz's enemies. There are two elements in verses 8 and 9. First, the specific enemies of Judah are described. Damascus is the capital of the kingdom of Aram, and Rezin was the king. Ephraim, of course, was one of the tribes of Israel, but by the time of the prophets, it came to be synonymous with the northern kingdom. In this passage, Ephraim refers to the northern kingdom of Israel as a whole. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom at this time. God stated that Ephraim would be too shattered to be a people, and this would happen within 65 years. So one of the chief things that Ahaz was afraid of, God's telling them that in 65 years, they're not even going to be a people. And this came to pass in 722 BC when the Assyrian Empire destroyed the city of Samaria and the northern kingdom. All that was left was a devastated territory populated by a few survivors and new people groups that the Assyrians resettled from other parts of their empire. These different people groups would intermarry, ultimately creating the ethnic group known as the Samaritans by the time of Jesus. The fact that the northern kingdom would be destroyed indicated that Aram would soon be gone as well. Isaiah was simply focused on the specific people of God at this point. So that's where the Samaritans came from, as we read through Scripture and we read about the Samaritans. Isaiah's prophecy came with such an admonition to Ahaz and Judah as well, to stand firm in their faith. King Ahaz had to act on faith. He and the people of Judah needed to align their actions with the idea that God would deliver them. If not, the consequences would be serious. Failure to believe God's prophetic word would mean that Ahaz and Judah would face similar fate to the northern kingdoms. You will not stand at all was an ominous warning. Failure to be faithful to God would result in sharing the fate of God's enemies. Unfortunately, Ahaz did not heed this warning. He was making political moves to secure his future. Faced with the fear of invasion, he would not trust God to deliver him. We look back at these scriptures and these accounts, and sometimes we judge harshly the people involved in them. But if we look back, is there a time when we've been called to stand firmer in our faith in light of overwhelming odds? And how did we do? There are times when I failed at that myself. So there's grace to be had there. We always need to trust God, no matter what we see. We know that God knows the end from the beginning, and He's promised to be faithful to us. Let's look at our next passage of scriptures, chapter 7, verses 10 through 13. And let's break them down a little bit. Let's take verses 10 and 11 first, and let's talk about them. Then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz. Ask for a sign from the Lord your God. It can be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. That's a pretty bold, not bold, that's not a good word to say. That's an astounding thing for God to tell someone to ask for. Basically, God's telling Ahaz, you can ask for a sign, you can ask for anything. It can be as deep as Sheol, the underworld, the place of death, or as high as heaven. The two extremes. There's a lot of room in between those two extremes. It's better to believe without the signs, obviously, but when God offers one, there's a reason for that. He's trying to make a point here. Ahaz could have asked for a sign, and it would have been given. But had he done that, and this is an important point to remember, if he had asked for a sign and it had been given to him, then he'd have no excuse for not following through on what God had promised to do and on trusting God. Sometimes we think that if we'd love to have a sign. There are instances in the Bible, especially I don't know the address right off the top of my head, but when someone asked Jesus for a sign, and he told them, you wouldn't believe if someone come back from the dead and told you, which he was going to do. So sometimes when we ask for a sign, we don't really want one, as Ahaz did in this case right here. He says, verses 12 and 13 says this, but Ahaz replied, I will not ask. I will not test the Lord. Let's stop right there for just a minute. That sounds really good. That sounds really pious. But remember, God has just told him to ask for a sign. I believe that Isaiah may be trying to worm his way out of something here. Sometimes people use really religious sounding terminology to get out of doing something they know they should do, or not doing something they want to do. Sometimes we're guilty of saying things when we're asked to do something that maybe for the church or for the kingdom, or something that somebody's asked us to do, and we know we probably should do that, and we really don't want to. Sometimes we'll say, well, I'll just have to pray about that. And that sounds really good. But sometimes that's just an excuse. And I'm guilty as anybody of that. Don't hear me pointing fingers, because I've got, when I'm pointing at somebody else, I've got three pointing right back at me, as the old saying goes. But listen to what God says. Again, let's follow up in verse 13. Isaiah said, listen, house of David. Is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of my God? Isaiah saw right through his scheme, and he kind of dressed him down a little bit. He said, listen, house of David, The impersonal house of David phrase likely served as a warning to Ahaz that he was still standing only because of God's covenantal promise to David, the covenant that he had made with David. It was not absolutely clear whether the patience of men refers to many or just to Isaiah, although the latter is more likely true, the commentary says. Ahaz did not have a good track record of listening to God's prophet. Now, however, the king also managed to try the patience of my God as well. Both Isaiah and God knew that Ahaz's pious excuse for refusing a sign was anything but pious. Let's look at verse 14 now. And this is a verse that we want to get into, just dig a little deeper in, because it's one that's really familiar to us, as I said earlier in our introduction. And as I sit outside this morning and record this, there's a little crispness to the air. Fall's coming, and when that happens, the holiday season can't be far behind, and we'll hear this verse repeated. You'll see it on Christmas cards. It'll be everywhere in just a few months. But there's a couple of things we need to dig into beneath surface level on this verse that we'll get into. And verse 14 is very familiar. Chapter 7, verse 14 says this: "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel," which, as we know, means God with us. The Lord himself is an emphatic statement. Even though Ahaz had refused to ask for a sign, God's going to give him one anyway. Ahaz would not have the excuse he hoped for. God's really short on excuses. He doesn't bear them well. When the fruits of his unfaithfulness became ripe, he wouldn't be able to blame God, which is such a kind of a ridiculous statement. The phrase, "the virgin will conceive," has been a source of disagreement, and this is what I want to talk about for just a few minutes, among interpreters. There are a few possibilities with respect to the Hebrew words in the text. The Hebrew word alma is difficult to translate. This word can mean virgin, but it's not limited to that idea, since it can also refer to a newly married woman or any young woman in some cases. The New Testament writers, of course, quote this verse and apply it to Mary and the birth of Jesus, rightfully so. How then do we understand Isaiah 7:14 in its original context? Is it specifically and only referring to Mary, Jesus, and the virgin birth, or could this verse have more than one fulfillment? So let's dig into this for just a few minutes. This is important for us to understand, I think. Three main choices present themselves as options for proper interpretation. First, some believe that the fulfillment of the sign of the Alma, the young woman or virgin, conceiving and giving birth, refers to the birth of Jesus and only that. This is possible, and it takes the New Testament use of the passage seriously. But this interpretation is not without its challenges. If the sign of Isaiah 7:14 refers only to Jesus, then the sign was largely a moot point for Ahaz and Judah at the time. Think about this. After all, if the sign didn't have any sort of fulfillment until the birth of Jesus, centuries later, then it offered no real immediate proof that God would take care of the crisis facing Ahaz and Judah. And I don't think I'd really thought of it from that perspective before. Because as we're reading our Bible, we refer immediately forward to the New Testament and think about Jesus. But if that was the only right interpretation of this prophecy, or fulfillment of this prophecy, then that wouldn't have had any bearing or wouldn't have meant anything to Ahaz and Judah. For this reason, some suggest a second interpretation. This is the view that in the Old Testament context, the child to be born was Isaiah's own child, as recorded in Isaiah 8:3. This view understands that the word Alma as a more general term, a young woman, since Isaiah's wife had already given Isaiah at least one child. If this second interpretation is correct, then we see a double fulfillment of the promise, an immediate fulfillment during the time of Ahaz, as well as a second and greater fulfillment in the birth of Jesus. The third interpretive option is similar to the second one, a double fulfillment, except that rather than pointing to Isaiah's wife, it assumes the woman in question was unknown at the time. So, you know, that's something that I think we need to think about, because that's an important point, that God was making a promise and a prophecy to Ahaz at the time, and if that fulfillment didn't come true until several hundred years later, then it would have no bearing. It would not bring home the point to Ahaz that God was trying to make. So I think this, either the second or the third interpretation, the double fulfillment, makes a lot of sense. Sometimes believers feel uncomfortable with the idea that a prophecy that Jesus fulfilled might have an immediate Old Testament fulfillment. And I think this is another important point for us to remember. Instead of being a reason for concern, this should be a matter of wonder at God's sovereignty. The God who inspired Scripture inspired these sections, knowing that they would have layers of fulfillment and bringing those events to pass in their appointed times. It's worth noting that understanding the historical context of Isaiah 7 can actually help us appreciate the sign being applied to Jesus. When Matthew quoted Isaiah 7:14, he was not just referring to the sign, he was pointing to the context of Isaiah and Ahaz's situation. At both points in history, Isaiah's time and Matthew's time, the threats and oppression of a foreign power faced the Jewish people. At both points, the people wondered if God would take care of them. At both points, the leaders were tempted to rely on their own power and plans to assure their futures. In both cases, God provided a sign that indicated he was indeed present and in control. The child in both cases is given the honorific title of Emmanuel, which means God with us. Of course, the child in Matthew, Jesus, was God physically with the people in a truly special way. He was the child forecast in Isaiah 9, the mighty God. In both cases, the people and leaders that were faced with a choice: would they believe in God and trust him, or would they rely on themselves? And I think that's a question for us to ask ourselves in as we're facing difficult days with things that are going on all around us. Just read the headlines, watch the news. You know, there are a lot of things happening that seem like the world's spinning out of control, but nothing's further from the truth, or farther from the truth. We are not spinning out of control. Nothing is out of God's control. None of the things that are happening in the world right now caught him by surprise. Let's look at verse 15. Talking about the child again. By the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating curds and honey. Now, why is that important, and what's the context of that? The phrases in this verse are an indication of how much time would pass for the immediate fulfillment of the prophecy. Most commentators agree that the time frame in mind was 2 to 4 years, as by this time children are able to make moral choices. Dairy was a staple in the ancient Near East, and it provided nourishment and was readily available. The honey was likely used to help offset the more sour-tasting curds. I've never eaten curds, but I've eaten plain Greek yogurt, and it's pretty sour, and honey makes it a whole lot better. So I'm thinking that's what they're talking about. A child would need to be at least a year old before these very basic foodstuffs were given to them. Interestingly enough, well, that was a hard one to say. After the punishment of God, the people of Judah would have to survive on this food as well. So how does knowing that the fuller context of Isaiah 7:14 help you to appreciate Matthew's application to the verse to Jesus more? Let me rephrase that. How does knowing the fuller context of Isaiah 7:14 help you appreciate Matthew's application of the verse to Jesus more? Does it challenge you to look at the passages differently? And I think we covered that pretty well, that yes, that in the context that there had to be a more immediate fulfillment of that prophecy to make sense to Ahaz at the time. Let's look at verses 16 and 17 now, and continuing from the last verse. Before the boy knows to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of two kings you dread will be abandoned. The Lord will bring on you, your people, and your father's house such a time as has never been since Ephraim separated from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. Continuing the thought of verse 15, God explained that before the promised child would reach the age of being able to discern good from evil, the nations that Ahaz worried about would be gone. Somewhere between birth and eating more solid food, and before the child knew he should reject what is bad and choose what is good, within 2 to 4 years, as we said a few moments ago, the threat from the northern enemies would be eliminated. In fact, the Lord told Ahaz that the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned. This is a general statement, since Aram would fall to the Assyrians in relatively quick order, but Israel would continue as a nation for some time. However, the northern kingdom of Israel would suffer defeat at the hands of the Assyrians and continue as a subjugated state within the empire of Assyria before its final fall in 722 BC. Unfortunately for King Ahaz and Judah, refusal to trust and believe God would bring dire consequences on them as well. Ahaz had refused the sign that God had offered because he had made up his mind to appeal to Assyria for deliverance from Aram and Israel. He wanted to do things his own way. Assyria was happy to oblige, but at a high cost. Ahaz had to pay a large amount of tribute or protection money. Doing so weakened the country of Judah and effectively submitted the country to Assyrian rule. In other words, Ahaz decided to pay the biggest bully on the playground to protect him and his country instead of trusting the loving God. As a result, Judah would suffer at the hands of the Assyrians. This was an ominous warning. In time, Assyria would ravage Judah and destroy most of her cities. Just in case Ahaz missed the significance of this threat, Isaiah spelled it out clearly. He will bring the king of Assyria. Ahaz had essentially invited a jaguar into his house to protect him from wild dogs on the outside. It's a matter of he chose not to trust God and got himself in thick to a situation that would lead to the destruction. A lot of times we want to trust to our own devices. We think we've got it all figured out. And rather than trust the promises of God, we want to trust that we've got this one, we've got this figured out. That's a bad choice. God has promised to be with us and to walk with us. And these promises don't mean that everything's always going to turn out like we want them to. Sometimes situations turn out exactly the opposite of what we want them to, even when we trust God. But we have to remember that God sees the whole picture that we don't see, and that we have to trust that He knows what He's doing. He knows the outcome, and He knows what's best for us. That's where the faith part comes in. That's where we have to trust God and trust Him for the outcome, and trust that He's good. We don't want to end up like Ahaz and suffer defeat at the hands of our enemies. So as we wrap up this lesson for today, let's take that verse and that promise that God's given us, and trust Him for the outcome. Thanks for joining us today. Look forward to the time when we start meeting in person again. God bless you. Have a great day.